Welcome everyone to our session on investing in resilience. My name is Nadia Kovalčíková and I'm a program manager at the German Marshall Fund. Resilience is one of the NATO's first line of defense. One of the hard lessons we have learned during the pandemics and infodemics is that investing in resilience is essential in order to effectively adapt to, learn, plan, withstand and recover from crises, but also be able to tackle conventional and unconventional threats. In today's session, we will zoom in on various actors, tools of interference, but also ways to raise NATO's level of ambition and resilience. But before we proceed to our discussion with our excellent speakers, I invite you to hear the video remarks of the Georgian Prime Minister, His Excellency Irakli Garibashvili.
Dear friends, the turbulent times we're living in are characterized by extraordinary challenges to the rules-based international order, founded on principles of international law and multilateralism, whereby certain actors directly challenge or covertly undermine this system, a system which is called to make our world more predictable, to resolve disputes in a peaceful manner, and to maintain security for the nations, notwithstanding their size or geographic location. As such, we are witnessing an ongoing systemic and value competition, marked by the growing attacks of authoritarianism on democracy. Variations of hybrid warfare have become especially pertinent markers of the mentioned competition, and democracies find themselves on the receiving end, oftentimes vulnerable and exposed. It requires awareness, unity, and coherent, thought-through and creative approaches to push back and defend against these new challenges. It is symptomatic that the NATO summit taking place in Brussels, as we speak, focuses on the issues of hybrid threats and resilience, as NATO, with its potential to adapt, is best equipped to put together knowledge and resources to fight against the mentioned threats. Long before the hybrid threats featured prominently in the discourse of our international partners and academics, Georgia has experienced firsthand their destructive nature. From the day Georgia regained its independence, it has been subjected to economic, energy, and trade blockades, cyber attacks, information warfare, and other types of non-conventional as well as conventional warfare. With 20% of Georgia still occupied by Russia and used as launchpad for its destructive policies, these hostile actions continue to this day. Notably, not only my country, but countries of the region, of Europe and beyond, have been subjected to the emerging security threats and are looking into ways to protect themselves. Hence, it is crucial for the like-minded states to join forces and share tools and experience to build the resilience, which has become a crucial concept not only in military, but much broader terms, the resilience of societies, founded on the shared principles of human rights, rule of law, good governance, and market economy. Even the strongest Western democracies experience difficulty withstanding these emerging challenges. And I am proud to note that Georgia has shown remarkable resilience throughout difficult times and has learned a thing or two about how to counter them. Strengthening Georgia's democratic institutions, boosting economic development, and pursuing modernization are some of the important endeavors that we pursue to be more resilient in the face of the external threats. However, it is evident that the complex nature of modern hybrid warfare requires a concerted effort and support of our partners. In that context, it is important that NATO Summit 2021 focuses on the NATO 2030 agenda, which will become a basis for the new strategic concept of the alliance. Issues such as modernizing capabilities, reinforcing collective defense through increased readiness, developing alliance-wide resilience objectives, as well as supporting resilience of partners are identified as key issues in the NATO 2030 document. We also welcome that reinvigoration of the NATO open-door policy is one of the key recommendations produced by the document and hope for the effective continuation of the policy in the years to come. For years, NATO has been actively investing and engaged in the resilience-building efforts in Georgia. We are committed to further deepening cooperation with NATO in this direction. For aspirant Georgia, this agenda is all the more pertinent as we prepare ourselves for the membership in the alliance. Because the more resilient each like-minded partner and each member is, the stronger NATO is. And this is the only way to prevail in the battle of systems of values for freedom and peace-loving nations. Thank you for your attention and wish you all a very productive discussion.
Following the video remarks of the Georgian Prime Minister, it is my pleasure to welcome our excellent speakers who are here today with me. I will first introduce all of them before we proceed to the remarks and to the questions and answers part. First, we have with us the honor to have Deputy Prime Minister of Ukraine, Olha Stefanishina. Welcome. We also have the pleasure to have with us the US Congressman Gerald Connolly, who is serving his 7th term in the US House of Representatives and is also the President of the NATO Parliamentary Assembly. Welcome. We have also with us Lauren Speranza, Director of Transatlantic Defense and Security at the Center for European Policy Analysis. Welcome, Lauren. Anna Wieslander is the next speaker, who is the Director for the Northern Europe at the Atlantic Council, but also the Chair of the Institute for Development and Security Policy. Welcome, Anna. And last but definitely not least, Tanya Latici, who is the policy analyst at the European Parliament Research Service, focusing on security and defense, but is also a member and colleague of the NATO 2030 Young Leaders Group appointed by the NATO Secretary General. Welcome, Tanya. Welcome to all of you. It's a pleasure to have you in the panel on investing in resilience. And I will start with you, Deputy Prime Minister. We have listened to the remarks of the Georgian Prime Minister, and we know that Ukraine has been also facing increased assertiveness of Russia, not only in the past months, but the past years. Could you share with us some lessons that Ukraine has learned in building and improving resilience, and something that you could also recommend for other countries to build on?
Thank you so much. It's a great pleasure to participate here in this discussion today, especially when it comes to the issue of resilience, of the country resilience, of the national resilience, and also when it comes to the issues of political resilience over geopolitical crises which are taking place now in the world. I'm very much in line with the messages which were delivered with the Georgian Prime Minister, especially given the fact that Ukraine and Georgia has faced a lot of common challenges, like the military aggression on our territories in the 21st century by Russian Federation, hybrid warfare, and basically now, in the light of the new NATO strategic concept 2030, the experience of our countries becomes the particular and significant contribution to building more resilient and more political allies. And today at the NATO summit, the leaders discussed how to make the alliance stronger, how to address rapidly evolving threats. Building resilience is at the core of this process, definitely. Ukrainian cooperation with the alliance is the effective response to the challenges facing both by Ukraine and by NATO, given the ongoing radical changes in the global security landscape. Ukraine remains a strong and reliable partner of NATO and makes its contribution to Euro-Atlantic security, and particularly its eastern flank. What is important for us and the takeaways of today's discussion is that we need to build a collective resilience to hybrid threats. We should strive for an adaptive, integrated, and coordinated approach to resilience, not only among NATO allies, but among allies and partners and those democracies which strive for better values. Allies support to Ukraine's efforts to strengthen our resilience against hybrid threats, including intensifying activities on the platform for countering hybrid warfare, is really crucial. Ukraine has the opportunity on a daily basis to share its experience with the allies and NATO, and it is been recognized as a valuable contribution to this collective security, also by the fact that a year ago, Ukraine has gained the status of the Enhanced Opportunities Partner. And only a year after this status has been granted, we've initiated the joint exercises together with the Ukraine and NATO, which is called Coherent Resilience 2021. Its goal is to support Ukrainian national authorities in enhancing their resilience against hybrid threats. It is an example of the possibilities of our practical cooperation, but also it is a very strong input Ukraine puts into building the collective resilience of the allies and the transatlantic security. We're eager to shape together with the allies the future architecture of European and Euro-Atlantic security, and thus Ukraine as jointly addresses the strategic threats of NATO's eastern flank. We are ready to intensify cooperation with NATO in the Black Sea region and count on the allies to prioritize the Black Sea. Just a couple of minutes ago, we heard the discussion at this forum about the Mediterranean dialogue and the security in this area. We consider that the Black Sea security becomes more and more important, and this region should be shaped up in a very strategic way, and this should be a very important part of the NATO 2030 process. Last year, Ukraine was granted the EOP status, and I've said that we're taking a lot of experience from there, but this has been the instrument of enormous transformations in our country. The instruments of increasing interoperability of our armed forces has been extremely effective. What comes to the challenges and the landscape on which we build the discussion today is that it is clear that the NATO and the whole democratic world is on a crossroad. The future of NATO is being decided really today, not in a 10-year period. The allies are looking for the answer on how to reinforce the alliance unity, strengthen collective defense. The partners, and especially those countries such as Ukraine, who aspires to join NATO, should be part of the answer. And I would say, even a bit different way, without having partners as part of the answer of the future collective and transatlantic unity and security, this would not be the answer. The world has changed radically. The new threats have emerged since NATO was founded over 70 years ago. The summit we see today and its outcomes really shows that there is a commitment of the world-leading democracies to reinforce the global security and to make more stable and predictable geopolitical landscape. In the post-Soviet space, the struggle between value systems like democracies and autocracies has intensified across all sectors right today. The outcome of this struggle will shape the international security. We should also stay resilient in the light of the upcoming threats to political stability and geopolitical landscape. Now, how NATO members view the future of the Eastern neighborhood is a critical question for all of us. The alliance is already lagging in some spheres behind without giving no clear answers. And we see that today's summit gives a lot of answers on the future of relations with Russia, with China, increasing military presence, and etc. Moscow has its own geopolitical master plan. We all know it, for the region and it's beyond. And it has been systemically implementing already since 1991. It's very important to see that the new transatlantic unity is built on the understanding that there is a master plan for support of the democratic developments in countries inside and across the NATO. Stepping up with the open door policy is an important signal for our country. It will give us the new strong incentive to proceed with the difficult reforms agenda, which are already well on track. Ukraine remains a strong supporter and contributor to the North Atlantic security, and we are looking forward for the outcomes of the summit and further dialogue built on these outcomes. Thank you.
Thank you, Prime Minister. And we are all looking forward also to the discussion with the next speakers. And I'd like to invite Congressman Connolly. Could you please reflect on the initial remarks of the Georgian Prime Minister and Ukrainian Deputy Minister? What does it mean for the NATO allies and partners to be resilient? And what can NATO do more to be more resilient?
Well, I think the first part of resilience is looking at obsolescence in our strategic concept. If in the current strategic plan we're now trying to revise, Russia is identified as a partner, and China isn't referred to at all. And most of the concerns we now are preoccupied with get very light treatment, if at all. Now, the idea that Russia could be a partner is absurd on its face. We've just heard from the Prime Minister and the Deputy of Georgia and the Deputy Prime Minister of Ukraine. Russia is clearly a malign actor. It represents an authoritarian alternative to democratic societies. It is aggressive about it. It seeks hegemony. It is occupying territory, sovereign territory in Ukraine, in Georgia, and Moldova as we speak. It has sought to undermine free elections in allied countries. It has menaced NATO members in the Baltics, has sought to undermine independent democratic structures in the Balkans, and is certainly aligning itself with an autocratic regime in Belarus. It is aggressively remilitarizing the Arctic, and NATO has to take cognizance of all of that and respond. China, we've got to recognize China is, yes, potentially an opportunity, but it's also a threat. Xi Jinping is aggressive and assertive in Chinese hegemony, not only in the South China Sea region and the Asia Pacific region, but through One Belt, One Road and the creation of new multilateral Chinese controlled banks, international financing, its own presence in the Arctic. China is an aggressive power that seeks to undermine and more than compete with, undermine democratic values, especially freedoms of speech, religion, dissent, political organizing, that presumably our alliance is all about. So taking cognizance of these autocratic authoritarian threats, I think is just paramount. Now, we also have other things we got to deal with, like climate change, like hybrid threats and third-party threats, terrorism particularly, but also, of course, the whole issue of cyber and the threats that rogue actors or state-supported actors can represent to free institutions, but also, frankly, to infrastructure itself. I believe with respect to resilience, the single most important thing NATO needs to do after 70 years is actually create architecture that puts our commitment to shared democratic values in operation. We have lots of mechanisms and lots of structures within NATO to promote collective security, and we've been very effective at it. We have not a single structure within NATO that's comparable in promoting democratic resilience. And if there's anything we're all about, it is our shared democratic values. That's in our charter, and it is what distinguishes us from Xi Jinping and Vladimir Putin. Otherwise, we become nothing more than a competing military bloc. So putting our words finally into structure so that we're promoting actively democracy. We're looking at best practices. We're serving as a clearinghouse and a resource within NATO itself for aspiring members, for existing members, for others outside of the alliance entirely. I think it's critical as we proceed toward our 2030 analysis and evaluation. So first things first, the most important resilience NATO has to, and I firmly believe must address, is democratic resilience. And that's why I favor creation, and the NATO Parliamentary Assembly, I might add, favors the creation of a Center for Democratic Resilience within NATO itself, not as an outside center of excellence, not only to show our commitment, but to actually start to propound it in active and operational ways. Thank you.
Thank you, Congressman. And building on these important points and building resilience to the aggression of Russia, the rise of China, the importance of preservance of the democratic values and democratic resilience. So understanding resilience in a quite a broader sense, as well as security has been understood more and more in the broader sense. So I will turn to you, Lauren, and I would like to see, where do you see the need? Why do we need to invest in a more adaptive, integrated, coordinated approach on resilience, and in which areas do you see the most need at this point?
Great. Well, thank you so much for having me. It's such an honor to be here on this distinguished panel. I think resilience is one of those concepts that has gained a lot of attention recently, but it's important to talk about what that really means. So fundamentally, resilience is about being able to withstand and recover from a variety of shocks. So we've talked about what some of those shocks are: cyber attacks, information operations, pandemics, natural disasters, other kinds of asymmetric and hybrid threats to our societies. So it's about having shared awareness of what the risks are associated with those events, how adversaries might be trying to manipulate them to undermine our societies to their own benefit, and having the resources, capacity, and plans in place to either mitigate the fallout of those attacks or events or prevent them from succeeding in the first place. And in essence, it's really our first line of collective defense because it's focused on prevention, preventing disruptions to our security and our stability, mitigating the damages and costs of those shocks, and denying adversaries the desired effects of their attacks. So really, in that way, it's very much linked to credible deterrence. Now, we've talked about democratic resilience a lot, but there's other kinds of resilience as well: economic, cyber, overall societal resilience. And each of those have security implications. So just as one example of what this looks like, think about what happens when a massive cyber attack cuts out a country's electric grid, or it takes financial systems offline, and your ATMs and your credit cards aren't working, or a pipeline is shut off and we don't have access to gas or energy. Resilience is about making our critical infrastructure resilient to those attacks by creating sufficient redundancies, by strengthening our active cyber defenses, and also by educating our publics and our journalists and our security services on how to respond, and starting to do exercises to test those capabilities and testing to failure so we can learn where our vulnerabilities are and how to adapt. Now, you asked a little bit about key areas of focus. So in addition to cyber resilience and critical infrastructure protection, I think in the society space, preventing manipulation of information flows and societal divisions, trying to promote independent media, producing content in multiple languages, doing journalist capacity building, reinforcing civil society programs to help publics understand and have the ability to combat foreign malign influence operations, but also strengthening crisis management capabilities like CBRN, humanitarian and natural disaster relief, stockpiling supplies, and enhancing crisis mobility, which was really important during the pandemic, where we saw NATO use military equipment for civilian purposes to help transport critical medical supplies and assistance to allies and partners. And I think we've talked sufficiently about the kind of national security connection to democratic resilience, tackling corruption, promoting public trust in institutions, good governance, including calling out violations of these principles when they happen inside NATO. But also in the economic sphere, illuminating economic vulnerabilities and dependencies, building more resilient supply chains by informing legislation and regulation and investment in strategic industries. Now, indeed, a lot of the responsibility for building this kind of resilience lies at the national level, but NATO has a key role to play, rooted in Article 3, the Resilience Clause of the Washington Treaty, because it can help member states set specific national resilience requirements and capability targets, including through the NATO defense planning process. And in doing so, that helps reduce each ally's vulnerabilities, but protects our interconnectivity and also strengthens collective defense. So I hope today at the summit, we'll see a further strengthening of the resilience pledge that allied leaders took in 2016, and maybe a more robust set of national resilience goals. And the last thing I would say is that resilience is so important now, because as the last year and a half has demonstrated, the security threats facing our societies are increasingly non-traditional. So we're going to continue to face things like pandemics and disinformation and election interference and climate change and migration and ransomware attacks. And they're all going to continue growing in speed and scale and complexity. So it's not just about withstanding a single shock, but multiple shocks sometimes simultaneously. And Of course, NATO's collective defense responsibilities in a traditional sense are not going away, but for NATO to be fit for purpose for today's world and for the next generation, NATO really has to focus more on resilience and broaden its approach to security. And it's also, in a very practical sense, cost effective. According to the UN and some other recent studies that have come out, for every dollar that you invest in specifically related to resilient infrastructure, you save about $4 to $6. So by investing in these methods of prevention up front, you save the money that would go towards mopping up the aftermath of these kinds of attacks. So not to mention the political cohesion, the strains on political cohesion, and the kind of waning support for public institutions that emerges when we face these crises. So I think resilience is so important because it helps us restore stability quickly and also generate improved strategies for similar issues in the future.
Thanks, Lauren, and you described so well why resilience is NATO's first line of defense and why we need to really invest more in resilience. And I'd like to turn now to Anna, because you have recently published a report on a transatlantic agenda for homeland security and resilience beyond COVID-19 pandemic. And I'd like you to share with us some of the findings of what NATO has already done well in building resilience and what can do more in your view, but also in terms of the cost effectiveness, as Lauren mentioned, how can we partner better perhaps with the EU, divide responsibilities, to share those responsibilities to be more complementary in improving transnational and transatlantic resilience. Anna, over to you.
Thank you so much, and thank you for having me. And so many good things already been said. I just want to focus a little bit on NATO and NATO EU then and on resilience. And just very briefly say that I think there is a first phase which was, as has been pointed out, initiated after the Russian aggression against Ukraine and our knowledge that we built up against on hybrid warfare. And this kind of peacetime gray zone activities that we needed to share. And that also sparked a NATO-EU cooperation on a staff-to-staff, pretty practical level on resilience from 2015 and onwards, marked at the Warsaw Summit also in 2016. We went from nice to need on this part. And what we have seen is, I think, there we have focused on society's ability to bounce back at a certain point. What we see now, moving into the next phase and onwards, I think is more about two things. It's about endurance. We realize that this is not about bouncing back and recovering quickly one time. It's doing it again and again and again and again. So we need an element of endurance when we talk about resilience also. It's not a one-off event. And especially this is when we look at climate change, I think. This really changes the discussion a lot in that sense, because we don't have one specific moment where we can say now we have dealt with effects of climate change. This needs to embrace everything. And I think NATO there has this past year started to look at this with fresh eyes. I'm positively taken by that. It's not an easy subject always to agree upon, but I think really NATO has done an analysis, Secretary General, on how to move forward there, and I think that's a good start. But you have a lot of effects there. Everything from up north, the ice melting, freedom of navigation affecting NATO in the north, to migration flows from the south affecting us. So this is a huge issue. And the second point I want to mention here is resilience to withstand increasing great power competition as a global phenomenon. And not only as perhaps we looked at it from 2015, more regionally coming from Russia. It has been mentioned here also now that it's also about China. It's also about this competition between democratic systems and the order we want to have and autocracies. And we have seen this very much so. And how do we build resilience towards that? That's a new kind of, it's also not a one thing event, not one democratic election which is interfered. This is an ongoing systematic challenge for us. And that also changes the way we have to look at resilience. So for both NATO and if we talk about NATO EU, the EU as well, we have seen a broadening of the resilience agenda from the more traditional one where we were focused on wartime or non-state activities, natural disasters and so on, to a much broader agenda. Those things remain, but we have also added on other issues. And this is a key question, I think, looking ahead. How broad should the resilience agenda be? Mm-hmm. You will have the strategic compass discussion for the EU, with the resilience basket, as we call it, very broad. And that's one of my concerns. Will it be too broad to really capture what we can do? And then you have the NATO strategic concept also having to deal with resilience. And I just want to round up there on NATO and what NATO could do on resilience and as you indicated, share this with the EU. It was mentioned here by Laurie in Article 3 also. I think the role of NATO, when you look at it, there has to be two dimensions of it. Moving further on the practical steps, setting the standards, giving the advice on how to advance planning nationally and what to do to pool the resources and kind of lower the transaction costs for member states to invest in resilience. Those are, practical steps you can do. You can use the methods from the NATO defense planning process, kind of borrowing how to work with the requirements in that regard. But then you need to add, in order to deal with climate change, global power competition, you need to add the consultative, more knowledge building aspect of it and really talk about these challenges so that we get a common perception, NATO partners and linking into the EU on the challenges. So NATO needs to work on two levels, as I see it, moving forward on resilience. And finally, working together with others, EU, private sector, and civil society. Without that, there will be no success for resilience measures ahead. Thank you.
Thank you, Anna. And now I would like to turn to Tanya. Tanya, we have already addressed the NATO-EU cooperation, but also the more citizens-focused approach, the need to understand resilience from the broader spectrum, but also have concrete steps and standards to actually be improving the resilience. So from your perspective, why do we have to improve the resilience and have also more of this citizen-focused approach and think a little bit more strategically in this, as we are not only thinking of the current challenges and tomorrow's challenges, but also the longer term challenges and threats we have to tackle. Over to you, Tanya.
Thank you very much. Nadia, you've given me the very difficult task of speaking after such inspiring intervention. So let me answer your question by pointing out three hopefully complementary aspects, which I think should have resilience as a key component. Strategy, NATO's relationship with the EU, and public debate. So first on strategy. When we see that when we start asking questions such as what does security and defense mean today? What do they mean in 10 years? We see that resilience is increasingly part of that answer. And resilience essentially, as has been said, underpins NATO's ability to withstand and to react to all these different wars by other means, we can call them, that we are facing. So it is indeed the very first line of defense. And I think what is key to understand and indeed very difficult to put in practice is that resilience must be a continuous, or as Anna put it, enduring effort that goes essentially beyond the current political popularity that this concept is enjoying. That resilience is not an end state, but rather a state of mind. And this approach, I think, this has to be reflected in our strategic approach to resilience, and it has to be reflected in the way we do more traditional aspects of defense and deterrence as we move on. That was briefly my first point. My second point on the relationship with the EU. Resilience has also become, I think, so coveted. This has been touched upon already because the security implications of economics, of trade, of climate and health, they have become much more obvious. So it could be argued that obviously they were always there, but now these implications seem to be in everyone's face. So I think that this aspect gives the EU-NATO relationship a new logic or a new dimension, if you will. Objectively, the EU has a much wider toolbox and many more prerogatives and instruments to create or to put up defenses when it comes to the security implications of economic linkages, supply chains, the climate, and many others. And in terms of defense as well, as Anna, I think, said it, the EU itself is exploring what resilience means in the context of its own common security and defense policy. And so I think here it is essential that NATO feeds into this process with the transatlantic defense angle, because as both the EU and NATO are hard at work creating these standards and benchmarks to meet resilience targets in all these fields, it is imperative that this is done in close collaboration so that the results coming out of these processes are compatible, interoperable, and can be owned politically by each country involved. And I think this objective can certainly be facilitated right now by the new momentum that we're seeing in the EU-US relationship, and can certainly be strengthened by the other strategic partnerships that the EU has with other NATO allies, such as Canada or Norway, for example. But the bottom line to this point is that if the EU is not resilient, NATO isn't either. And I think this is the statement that should guide the logic of the relationship as we move forward. That was briefly my second point. Now, my third and final point, which you also asked me to touch upon, the public or the impact on the citizens. Now, here I mentioned before that these risks and threats that have created this need for resilience are now much more in everyone's face. And I think it's precisely because of this that there is a demand for politicians, for international organizations, to adapt the more traditional conception of defense that we have to what citizens need and want defended today and in 10 years. So the bottom level must be allowed to feed into the top level, because ultimately resilience is going to be implemented at the local and individual levels. And here, perhaps, if I can bring in a more young leaders perspective, in our NATO 2030 report for the NATO Secretary General, we argued that NATO has to deter, defend, and provide security differently in 2030. And we point out that resilience is a moving target that requires continuous adaptation, not only of policy, but, for example, of the way we conceive of burden sharing. And for us, resilience includes 8 pillars, and one of them, which has been emphasized so well by Congressman Connolly, is democratic resilience. And our, let's say, overarching vision for Euro-Atlantic resilience is for NATO to become a resilience pathfinder. And I think here it's very good news to see, for instance, the quick launch of the Euro-Atlantic Center for Resilience in Romania. And practically another point that we recommend is that NATO develops what we call an internal resilience barometer. So this is an instrument that we imagine would set and articulate clear and tailor-made targets for each ally to achieve not only the highest level of national resilience, but ultimately collective resilience. And this is one of the proposals that I was very happy to see was reflected in the Secretary General's NATO 2030 agenda that is today on NATO leaders' tables. So I think we could say that that's a win for resilience, and it's also a win for young people getting their ideas taken seriously, finally. So those are my three quick points. Back to you, Nadia.
Thanks, Tanya, and very concrete points as well. So a lot of food for thought to potentially be implemented also by the leaders and discussed further also at the summit today. Fingers crossed, exactly. I'd like to turn back now to Lauren and Anna, because you both mentioned in your report or in your remarks also the resilience to cyber threats. And we have seen in December last year, perhaps one of the most serious cyber threats at the US government agency, so-called the solar wind attacks. And in the report, Anna, you mentioned the need to invest in human capital, which may help to build resilience against cyber attacks. So both Anna and Lauren, perhaps starting with Lauren now, as Anna spoke more recently. Lauren, what do you think is the way to build resilience against cyber threats?
It's a great question. And I think this is one area that transcends both the kind of conventional military resilience as well as broader civil society resilience, because, of course, conventional capabilities can't operate if they don't have resilient infrastructures and cyber networks to utilize. So it's crucial there, but it's also critical to every function of society. So in terms of how do we build greater resilience, I mean, I think it's important to remember that NATO, of course, has decided that a cyber attack can trigger Article 5, but building resilience is actually what happens in the space up until that. So getting more comfortable doing things to protect our networks, before we reach the Article 5 threshold. Part of this is about building stronger cyber defenses, but also more active defenses. So doing things that can track threats before they actually reach our networks. And so being willing to be a little bit more proactive is really important here. We have, of course, the Center of Excellence for Cyber Defense and Cooperation in Tallinn, but I think building out NATO's Cyber Operations Center has been really important, and thinking about what we can do in our networks in the below threshold space is going to be key. And I think your point on talent, I'm sure Anna will touch on this, but I think it's about, this is a great place to bring in young people into the alliance and to take advantage of their cyber and technical expertise to help us build more resilient architectures and cyber hunt teams and things that can help us be more proactive in cyberspace, and making sure we have the right talent and skills to do that across our military and civilian structures is really important.
Thanks, Lauren. And now I was informed we have less than 1 minute. So Anna, if you can be very brief with your answers, so I can also give the last one-sentence response to all the other panelists.
Yes, I'll be very brief. I think human capital, what we point out is that it's important to realize that there is a big competition about this kind of expertise also. So you might have to invest in it. You have to have systems of kind of cyber soldiers that have ordinary work, so that you have people that really can do the cyber defense that you need to do. You need to have people, even though it's about technology. And the second one was to really increase also public-private partnerships on this, because you will have a different interest between corporations and public authorities, but you need to align and make procedures and understand each other and have very short ways of handling these kind of threats. So
perfect. And thank you for being so succinct. So just to summarize, one word from each of the panelists. Which area is the most important to invest in resilience in the context of NATO allies and the partners, starting with the Deputy Prime Minister. Please try one word or two words. Which area is the most important to invest in resilience?
Supporting young democracies.
Thank you. Congressman Connolly?
Democracy is our raison d'etre. It rises way above every other challenge we face. We have challenges from both within and without, and we must respond to those challenges. January 6th certainly made that clear in America.
Thank you. Tanya?
I agree with what has been said, so I'll just say we need to revise burden sharing, because burden sharing underpins the way we see the transatlantic relationship, and it's a way to become more resilient and to go towards a more mature and advanced step in the transatlantic relationship.
Thanks. Lauren, one word perhaps, or two?
Sure, I'll stick with cyber, just because it's so transcendent across all aspects of security.
Thanks a lot. And Anna, you conclude.
Well, I would say for NATO, a focus still on collective defense, but with a new kind of interpretation of it, or a broader one, including cyber, including space, including resilience towards climate change.
Thanks so much. Thank you to all our fantastic panelists. I think we have heard and learned a lot of interesting ideas. I hope many of them will be implemented. And now I'd like to invite all of you to the next very lively debate, Face of Debate, which will be moderated by my colleague Cristina Kausch from Madrid. And the question is to be answered, is informality the answer to global crisis management? Is it? Please listen.